Have you ever wondered why the most compassionate people often struggle with their relationship to God? It's a pattern I've observed repeatedly. Individuals with boundless empathy who exhaust themselves caring for others, yet feel a spiritual emptiness they can't explain. This peculiar disconnect appears throughout history. Saints who perform miraculous acts of kindness while privately battling devastating darkness. Modern humanitarian workers who save countless lives, yet report a growing void in their soul. Spiritual leaders who care deeply for their flock, while their personal connection to the divine withers. This isn't coincidental. In fact, it might be one of the most disturbing spiritual paradoxes of our time, that the very compassion celebrated as the highest virtue in most religious traditions might simultaneously be undermining our authentic relationship with the divine. Think about it. Compassion is universally praised. It stands at the core of Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and virtually every humanitarian secular ethic. Love thy neighbor resonates across cultures as the ultimate moral imperative. Yet something mysterious happens when this virtue is taken to its extreme, when compassion becomes boundless, unregulated, and all-consuming. What if there's a tipping point where our empathy for others begins to erase our own spiritual voice, where our compassion, rather than connecting us to God, actually creates a barrier between us and the divine? This isn't about promoting selfishness or abandoning kindness, far from it. It's about understanding a subtle spiritual mechanism that has been overlooked for centuries, one that affects millions of well-meaning people who can't understand why their genuine attempts to embody divine love leave them feeling spiritually barren. A 19th-century philosopher, working in isolation and suffering from debilitating illness, identified this paradox with unsettling clarity. His insights were deemed so dangerous and contrary to established religious thinking that they were systematically dismissed, misinterpreted, and buried. Yet, as we'll see, his observations might hold the key to understanding why so many compassionate souls feel abandoned by the very God they're trying to emulate. What happens when the virtue we cherish most becomes the very thing that separates us from authentic spirituality? What's the invisible line between self-sacrifice and self-erasure? And why might God himself reject the compassion that denies your own divine spark? I invite you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about compassion, because the answers might fundamentally transform your understanding of both human virtue and divine connection. What if the path to authentic spirituality requires questioning our most cherished assumptions about what it means to be good? Let's begin with an observation that might seem counterintuitive. The more someone prioritizes compassion for others, the more likely they are to experience spiritual burnout, crisis of faith, or what medieval mystics called the dark night of the soul. The pattern emerges with striking consistency across diverse spiritual traditions. Mother Teresa's private journals, revealed after her death, documented decades of spiritual emptiness, despite her world-renowned compassionate work. The 16th-century mystic, St. John of the Cross, who devoted his life to caring for others, developed the very concept of spiritual darkness after experiencing it profoundly himself. Contemporary studies of clergy burnout reveal that those most dedicated to pastoral care show the highest rates of spiritual depletion, a phenomenon some theologians call compassion fatigue. But this isn't just about exhaustion. There's something deeper and more troubling at work. When researchers at Duke University studied long-term humanitarian workers, they found a disturbing trend. Those who maintained the strongest boundaries and occasionally prioritized their own needs reported stronger spiritual well-being than those who practiced boundless compassion. Similarly, a survey of monastics from contemplative traditions showed that those who balanced compassionate service with personal spiritual practice maintained their sense of divine connection, while those who focused exclusively on service to others often described feeling abandoned by God. This pattern extends beyond religious contexts. Even in secular settings, the most empathetic therapists, nurses, and social workers report higher rates of what psychologists call existential vacuum, a profound sense of meaninglessness despite doing meaningful work. What's happening here? How can the virtue most associated with spiritual fulfillment lead to spiritual emptiness? The anomaly becomes even more perplexing when we examine religious texts. While all major traditions celebrate compassion, they also contain curious warnings about its potential dangers. Jesus asked, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul?" Buddha taught compassion, but warned against attachment to others' suffering. The Jewish concept of chesed shel emet distinguishes between true kindness and misguided kindness. Islamic teachings emphasize that charity begins with the self. These cautionary notes within traditions that otherwise celebrate compassion suggest an ancient awareness of the paradox we're exploring. Contemporary spiritual teachers occasionally touch on this contradiction, but rarely explore its full implications. Even the Dalai Lama, while advocating universal compassion, emphasizes that it must begin with self-compassion. Christian theologian Henry Nouwen wrote extensively about how helping professionals often use compassion to avoid their own spiritual journey. But these insights remain peripheral to mainstream spiritual teaching, which continues to promote unlimited compassion as an unqualified good. This brings us to the central question. Is there a form of compassion that God would reject? Not because it's insincere, but because it violates something essential about our spiritual nature. What if our modern understanding of compassion has drifted away from its original meaning, morphing into something that actually obstructs authentic spirituality rather than expressing it? In 1879, Friedrich Nietzsche resigned from his professorship at the University of Basel, his health shattered. Plagued by debilitating migraines, stomach ailments, and deteriorating eyesight that bordered on blindness, he retreated to the solitude of the Swiss and Italian Alps. There, living in modest rented rooms, subsisting on a minimal pension, and enduring physical pain that would have crushed most people, Nietzsche began the most productive philosophical period of his life, one that would produce insights about compassion that religious authorities found deeply threatening. What's particularly remarkable about Nietzsche's situation was how it positioned him to see what others couldn't. He himself was the recipient of compassion. Friends and family pitied his condition and offered support. Yet simultaneously, he observed how this very compassion subtly diminished him, reducing his complex being to an object of pity rather than a full spiritual entity. This unique vantage point, being both a philosopher and the target of well-meaning compassion, allowed him to experience firsthand the spiritual dangers of being seen primarily through the lens of suffering. During long walks in the mountains, the only time he found relief from his physical pain, Nietzsche contemplated the nature of compassion from angles that conventional religious thinking had never considered. He wasn't merely theorizing, he was living the question. What happens to the human spirit when it becomes defined by suffering? What happens to your relationship with God when others' compassion begins to shape your identity? Nietzsche's own experience as an invalid gave him unique insights into how compassion, when misapplied, could actually obstruct authentic spirituality rather than nurture it. This wasn't a rejection of kindness or care. Nietzsche himself deeply valued true friendship and genuine human connection. Rather, it was a recognition that something essential was being lost in the modern understanding of compassion. The Greek word for compassion, sympatheia, originally meant feeling with rather than feeling for, suggesting a fundamental equality between people rather than the hierarchical relationship that pitying compassion creates. Similarly, the Latin compati implied shared suffering, not the bestowal of care from a position of superiority. Nietzsche saw that this subtle shift in meaning had profound spiritual implications. In his personal notebooks from this period, Nietzsche wrote, "When someone looks at me with compassionate eyes, something in me resists, as if they were trying to take away my right to my own suffering, to incorporate my pain into their worldview rather than allowing it to belong to my own spiritual journey." This insight emerged directly from his experience of being the recipient of well-intended compassion that nevertheless felt spiritually diminishing. He recognized that true spiritual connection, whether with other humans or with God, required maintaining the integrity of one's own experience rather than surrendering it to another's interpretation. What distinguished Nietzsche from other critics of religion was that he wasn't attacking compassion from a position of callousness or indifference to suffering. He was identifying, with surgical precision, how a particular form of compassion could actually sever our connection to our own spiritual voice and, by extension, to authentic divine connection. Nietzsche's first significant insight appears in The Gay Science, published in 1882, where he makes a distinction that would prove revolutionary. There is a higher kind of compassion, he writes, which maintains the dignity of the sufferer rather than alleviating suffering at any cost. This wasn't merely philosophical speculation, but an observation based on historical patterns. Throughout Christian history, Nietzsche identified moments when compassion had transformed from a virtue that honored the full humanity of others into a mechanism that reduced them to their suffering alone. Consider the historical evolution of Christian compassion. In the early church, compassion manifested as community support that maintained the dignity and spiritual agency of those in need. The Acts of the Apostles describes communities where resources were shared, but individual spiritual journeys were respected. By the medieval period, however, compassion had increasingly become institutionalized and hierarchical. Almsgiving was considered virtuous primarily for the giver, with little consideration for how it affected the recipient's spiritual dignity. The poor and suffering became objects of compassion rather than full spiritual beings in their own right. This transformation accelerated in the modern era. Nietzsche observed how 19th-century philanthropy, though well-intentioned, often reduced recipients to passive objects of pity rather than spiritual equals. He documented specific cases, religious charity schools that provided education while systematically erasing cultural identity, missionary efforts that offered material support while demanding spiritual conformity, welfare systems that addressed physical needs while ignoring spiritual autonomy. In each case, compassion had become a mechanism that silenced the recipient's unique spiritual voice. The evidence extends beyond institutional practices to individual spiritual experience. Nietzsche collected accounts from various sources, letters, diaries, literature, showing how recipients of boundless compassion often felt diminished rather than uplifted. A particularly striking example comes from his analysis of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where Prince Mishkin's unlimited compassion paradoxically damages those he tries to help by denying them the dignity of their own spiritual struggles. Nietzsche saw this as a perfect literary illustration of how excessive compassion could actually impede authentic spiritual development. But the most compelling evidence came from religious texts themselves. Nietzsche noted how Jesus, despite being portrayed as the embodiment of compassion, often challenged those who sought his help rather than simply relieving their suffering. When the rich young ruler asked what he must do to inherit eternal life, Jesus didn't offer comfort but challenge. Sell all you possess and give to the poor. To the woman caught in adultery, he offered protection from persecution, but also the challenging words, "Go and sin no more." These weren't acts of boundless compassion that removed all suffering, but interventions that honored the spiritual agency of the other. What if the compassion God values most isn't the kind that erases suffering at any cost, but the kind that honors the full spiritual dignity of both self and other? To truly understand how compassion can become spiritually corrosive, we must examine what Nietzsche called the psychological mechanism of self-forgetting in compassion. In his 1886 work, Beyond Good and Evil, he describes how well-meaning individuals gradually surrender their own spiritual perspective as they become increasingly identified with responding to others' needs. This isn't a dramatic renunciation, but a subtle, incremental process, one that happens beneath conscious awareness and is all the more dangerous for its invisibility. The process begins innocently enough. A spiritually inclined person, motivated by genuine care, responds to someone else's suffering. The initial response is balanced. They maintain their own perspective while offering support. But something shifts as compassion becomes habitual. The compassionate person begins to organize their identity around responding to others' needs. Their attention turns increasingly outward, away from their own spiritual center. Eventually, they develop what Nietzsche called a reflexive compassion, automatically seeing the world through the lens of others' suffering rather than through their own direct experience. This psychological process creates a specific form of spiritual disruption that Nietzsche termed the compassion that denies God. not because it rejects the divine explicitly, but because it gradually erases the unique channel through which a person can experience authentic spiritual connection. God, or the divine in whatever tradition, doesn't speak generically, but through the specific spiritual consciousness of each individual. When that consciousness becomes habitually oriented away from itself and toward others' suffering, the channel for direct divine communication becomes obstructed. Nietzsche documented this phenomenon in the lives of various historical figures. Consider Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic who literally starved herself to death out of solidarity with those suffering during World War II. While her compassion was extraordinary, her writings reveal how her identification with others' suffering gradually eroded her capacity to hear her own spiritual voice. Or Albert Schweitzer, whose boundless compassion for the people of Africa led to remarkable humanitarian work, but, as his journals reveal, a gradual emptying of his personal spiritual experience. More evidence comes from psychological studies that Nietzsche anticipated but couldn't access. Modern research on compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma confirms his insight that excessive focus on others' suffering can create a specific form of spiritual exhaustion. What's particularly relevant is that this isn't merely emotional burnout, but a deeper disorientation, where compassionate individuals report feeling disconnected from their values, purpose, and sense of meaning, precisely the spiritual elements Nietzsche identified as essential for authentic divine connection. The spiritual consequences of this self-erasure are profound. When compassion becomes all-consuming, prayer often becomes intercessory rather than contemplative, always asking for others rather than listening for God's voice. Meditation becomes focused on generating compassion rather than experiencing direct insight. Scripture reading becomes a search for guidance in helping others rather than personal spiritual nourishment. In each case, the spiritual practice that should connect the individual directly to God becomes reoriented away from that connection and toward others. Could it be that God is calling you to a form of compassion that maintains rather than erases your unique spiritual channel? As we piece together the evidence, a disturbing pattern emerges, one that Nietzsche articulated in On the Genealogy of Morals, but that religious authorities have consistently ignored or misinterpreted. What he called the great danger wasn't compassion itself, but a specific historical transformation of compassion from a balanced spiritual virtue into what he termed the morality of self-abnegation. This transformation has deep historical roots that extend far beyond individual psychology into the very structure of religious thought in the Western world. The pattern begins with an ancient understanding of compassion that maintained spiritual balance. In early Christian communities, as documented in the Pauline epistles, compassion was practiced within a framework that recognized the spiritual integrity of both giver and receiver. Paul's advice to bear one another's burdens was balanced by his emphasis on each person's responsibility for their own spiritual journey. Each one should test their own actions. The Desert Fathers and Mothers of early Christian monasticism similarly maintained this balance, offering care to those in need while emphasizing the importance of preserving one's own contemplative practice. But a shift occurred during the medieval period, accelerating through the Protestant Reformation and reaching its apotheosis in modern Christianity. Compassion increasingly became untethered from spiritual discernment. The emphasis shifted from balanced spiritual relationship to one-sided self-sacrifice. This transformation wasn't random, but, as Nietzsche demonstrated through textual analysis of theological writings across centuries, a systematic reinterpretation of Jesus' teaching from a balanced spiritual ethic to a morality centered on self-denial as the highest virtue. This historical pattern extends beyond Christianity. Nietzsche noted similar transformations in other traditions, particularly in how Western interpreters approached Eastern philosophies. The Buddha's teaching of compassion, karuna, was always balanced by wisdom, prajna, and included explicit warnings against compassion becoming attachment to others' suffering. Yet Western appropriations of Buddhism often emphasized compassion while downplaying the equally important wisdom component that maintained spiritual balance. The same pattern appeared in Western interpretations of Hindu devotional traditions and Sufi mysticism, a selective emphasis on compassionate elements while minimizing the aspects that preserved spiritual integrity. The pattern continues in religious institutions. Nietzsche documented how organizations founded with balanced spiritual principles often evolved toward prioritizing compassionate service at the expense of contemplative practice. Religious orders initially established with dual commitments to prayer and service gradually shifted their emphasis toward service alone. Seminaries that once balanced theological study and spiritual formation increasingly focused on pastoral skills at the expense of contemplative depth. In each case, the institutional embodiment of religion recapitulated the larger historical pattern of compassion becoming detached from spiritual discernment. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is how it masquerades as spiritual advancement. The progressive erasure of one's own spiritual voice in favor of responding to others' needs is culturally reinforced as growth in virtue rather than identified as spiritual imbalance. Religious communities consistently praise those who sacrifice their own spiritual well-being for others, creating what Nietzsche called a hierarchy of spiritual value that places self-denial at the summit. What does it mean when the very virtue meant to express divine love begins to obstruct your ability to hear the divine voice? The implications of Nietzsche's analysis extend far beyond abstract philosophy into the practical reality of spiritual life. If unchecked compassion can actually obstruct authentic divine connection, then many of our basic assumptions about spiritual development require radical reconsideration. This isn't merely an academic concern, but a matter with profound consequences for how we understand our relationship with God and practice our faith. First, we must confront what Nietzsche called the compassion trap, the way excessive focus on others' suffering can create a spiritual dead end. Many compassionate individuals find themselves in an exhausting cycle. They respond to suffering, feel temporarily fulfilled, then encounter more suffering, respond again, and eventually reach a point of spiritual depletion. Yet because compassion is culturally reinforced as an unqualified good, they assume the solution is simply more compassion, trying harder, giving more, extending themselves further. This creates a closed loop where the very thing depleting their spiritual resources is prescribed as the solution to that depletion. The theological implications are equally significant. If God values the integrity of our unique spiritual channel more than our boundless compassion for others, then much religious teaching requires re-examination. The common interpretation of Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself assumes the as yourself portion is automatic and focuses exclusively on the love your neighbor dimension. But what if the as yourself wasn't merely an assumption but an essential prerequisite, a recognition that authentic love for others must be grounded in maintaining one's own spiritual integrity? Similarly, the concept of self-sacrifice requires reconsideration. Traditional interpretations emphasize surrendering everything for others. But Nietzsche's analysis suggests a crucial distinction between sacrificing one's preferences or comfort, which can be spiritually appropriate, and sacrificing one's spiritual discernment or integrity, which undermines the very foundation of authentic relationship with God. This distinction rarely appears in religious teaching, yet makes the difference between self-sacrifice that expresses divine love and self-erasure that obstructs it. The implications extend to prayer and spiritual practice. If maintaining one's direct channel to God is essential for authentic spirituality, then practices that restore and protect that channel become not selfish indulgences but spiritual necessities. Contemplative prayer, periods of spiritual withdrawal, and practices of discernment aren't luxuries for the spiritually privileged but essential disciplines for anyone seeking authentic divine connection. This directly challenges the common assumption that more time serving others always equals greater spiritual virtue. For religious communities, the implications are particularly challenging. Nietzsche's analysis suggests that communities which praise boundless compassion without equal emphasis on spiritual discernment may be inadvertently promoting a form of compassion that God himself would reject, not because it lacks sincerity, but because it erases the very channel through which authentic divine connection becomes possible. This requires a fundamental rethinking of how we teach, practice, and celebrate compassion within religious contexts. Perhaps most profound is the implication that God might actually reject certain forms of compassion not because they aren't well intended, but because they violate the spiritual integrity he values more highly. This suggests a divine perspective far more nuanced than the simplistic equation of virtue with self-abnegation that dominates much religious thinking. Why has this crucial insight about the spiritual dangers of unchecked compassion been so consistently overlooked or actively suppressed? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of misapplied virtue, a systematic cultural mechanism that elevates self-abnegation as the highest spiritual ideal while dismissing any questioning of this ideal as selfishness. This conspiracy isn't the result of malicious intent, but emerges from deep historical patterns in how religious ideas evolved, particularly in Western traditions. The historical roots of this conspiracy trace back to specific theological developments. During the medieval period, as Nietzsche documented in his analysis of theological texts, there was a gradual shift from understanding Jesus' sacrifice as a unique divine act towards seeing it as a universal model for human behavior. This transformed the Christian message from one of spiritual liberation to one of imitative self-denial. Theological writings increasingly emphasized passages about self-sacrifice, while downplaying equally important teachings about spiritual discernment, creating what Nietzsche called a selective reading that distorts the original balance. This theological shift served institutional purposes. Religious organizations benefit when members prioritize service to others, often channeled through the institution itself, over personal spiritual discernment, which might lead to questioning institutional authority. Nietzsche observed how the emphasis on boundless compassion conveniently aligned with ecclesiastical needs for devoted workers who wouldn't question the spiritual frameworks they operated within. This wasn't necessarily conscious manipulation, but a natural institutional evolution toward what reinforced the organization's stability and influence. The conspiracy extends beyond religious institutions to broader cultural patterns. Nietzsche identified how societies benefit from promoting unlimited compassion as the highest virtue. It creates citizens who willingly sacrifice their own well-being for others, often in ways that maintain social stability without challenging underlying systems. By elevating self-abnegation to the status of spiritual ideal, cultures effectively create a moral framework that discourages questioning of systemic issues by redirecting spiritual energy toward individual acts of compassion rather than structural analysis or reform. What's particularly insidious about this conspiracy is how it weaponizes morality against spiritual authenticity. Anyone questioning whether boundless compassion might actually be spiritually harmful can be immediately dismissed as selfish, spiritually immature, or lacking in virtue. This creates what Nietzsche called a perfect trap. The very act of identifying the spiritual danger becomes evidence that one needs more of the very thing causing the danger. The conspiracy thus becomes self-protecting, as those who might expose it are discredited by the very moral framework they're trying to examine. This conspiracy isn't maintained through conscious deception, but through what Nietzsche termed the inertia of inherited virtue, the tendency of moral systems to perpetuate themselves without re-examination. Religious teachers inherit a framework that equates spiritual growth with self-abnegation and pass it on without questioning whether this might sometimes obstruct rather than express authentic divine connection. Spiritual seekers absorb these teachings and measure their progress by how completely they can silence their own spiritual voice in service to others. The entire system becomes self-reinforcing despite potentially undermining the very spiritual connection it claims to nurture. The result is a widespread spiritual condition that Nietzsche described as compassion sickness. Millions of well-intentioned people exhausting themselves in service to others while experiencing a growing spiritual emptiness they can't explain and aren't permitted to question. Their compassion, far from connecting them more deeply to God, actually creates a barrier between them and authentic divine connection. Yet the moral framework they operate within prevents them from recognizing or addressing this spiritual dead end. The most disturbing aspect of this spiritual distortion isn't just its existence, but the systematic way it has been protected from scrutiny. Nietzsche's insights about the potential spiritual dangers of unchecked compassion weren't merely overlooked. They were actively suppressed, misrepresented, and dismissed by religious authorities. This wasn't random, but, as Nietzsche documented, a predictable response to a perspective that threatened fundamental assumptions about virtue and spiritual development. The primary mechanism of this suppression has been mischaracterization. When Nietzsche questioned whether unlimited compassion might sometimes obstruct authentic spirituality, his critique was routinely distorted as an attack on kindness itself or a promotion of callous indifference to suffering. This deliberate misrepresentation created what he called a false choice: either embrace boundless compassion without question or reject compassion entirely. The nuanced position that there might be a form of compassion that maintains spiritual integrity and a form that erodes it was systematically excluded from religious discourse. Religious institutions had practical reasons for this suppression. Nietzsche observed how organizations that depend on voluntary service have a vested interest in promoting unlimited self-sacrifice as the highest spiritual ideal. A more balanced understanding of compassion, one that recognized the importance of maintaining one's own spiritual channel, might lead to fewer volunteers, reduced donations, and less institutional control over members' spiritual lives. While not necessarily conscious, this institutional self-protection led to the marginalization of perspectives that questioned whether boundless compassion always aligned with divine will. The suppression was reinforced by theological frameworks that made questioning unlimited compassion appear spiritually suspect. Nietzsche documented how concepts like dying to self and taking up one's cross were selectively emphasized over equally important biblical themes of discernment and spiritual integrity. This created a theological environment where expressing concerns about the spiritual costs of unchecked compassion could be immediately dismissed as evidence of spiritual immaturity or selfishness, effectively silencing the very questions that might lead to a more balanced understanding. Cultural factors further entrenched this suppression. Nietzsche noted how Western societies increasingly measured moral worth by visible service to others, rather than by the maintenance of internal spiritual integrity. This created social pressure to demonstrate compassion through continuous self-sacrifice, with any hesitation or boundary setting interpreted as moral deficiency. The resulting culture made it nearly impossible to raise questions about whether unlimited compassion might sometimes obstruct rather than express authentic spirituality without facing social judgment. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of spiritual experience. He collected numerous accounts of compassionate individuals who experienced spiritual depletion, loss of divine connection, or what mystics called the dark night of the soul, as they increasingly surrendered their own spiritual voice to respond to others' needs. Yet rather than recognizing these experiences as potential warning signs of spiritual imbalance, religious authorities typically interpreted them as tests to be endured or opportunities for further self-sacrifice, reinforcing rather than questioning the very pattern that created the spiritual distress. This multi-layered suppression has resulted in what Nietzsche termed an epidemic of misguided virtue, millions of well-intentioned people practicing a form of compassion that gradually erodes their connection to God, while believing this erosion represents spiritual growth. The conspiracy isn't the result of malicious intent, but of deeply entrenched patterns in how we understand, teach, and celebrate virtue, patterns that have effectively protected unchecked compassion from the very scrutiny that might reveal its potential spiritual dangers. The final question isn't whether compassion is good or bad, it's whether the form of compassion we've been taught to practice is actually the form that God values most. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't a rejection of compassion, but a profound recalibration of how we understand its relationship to authentic spirituality. What if God desires not the erasure of your unique spiritual voice in service to others, but the maintenance of that voice as the very channel through which divine love can authentically flow? This requires a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize compassion. Rather than seeing it as unlimited self-sacrifice, we might understand it as what Nietzsche called the compassion that preserves spiritual integrity, a form of care that honors both the sufferer and the one offering care as full spiritual beings. This isn't selfish but spiritually honest, recognizing that authentic divine connection flows through our unique spiritual consciousness rather than around or despite it. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of measuring spiritual growth by how completely you can silence your own needs in service to others, you might begin evaluating whether your compassionate actions maintain or erode your sense of divine connection. This creates a different spiritual metric, not how much you sacrifice, but whether your sacrifice expresses or obstructs the authentic voice of God within you.
The question becomes not, did I give enough? But did I give in a way that maintained spiritual integrity for both myself and the other? For those caught in the compassion trap, exhausting themselves in service while feeling increasingly distant from God, Nietzsche offers a radical but healing perspective. Your spiritual emptiness isn't a sign of failure, but a warning that your compassion has crossed the line from divine expression to spiritual self-erasure.
This isn't an indictment, but an invitation to recalibrate, to discover a form of compassion that nourishes rather than depletes your connection to the divine. This recalibration involves specific practices, regular periods of spiritual withdrawal, not as selfish indulgence but as essential maintenance of your divine channel. Contemplative prayer that focuses on listening for God's voice rather than just asking for help in serving others. Discernment practices that help distinguish between divine guidance and conditioned responses to others' suffering. Boundary setting that recognizes the spiritual importance of maintaining your own unique relationship with God, even as you care for others. The most profound transformation comes in understanding what God Himself might value most. What if God, rather than demanding the erasure of your spiritual voice in service to others, actually cherishes that voice as the unique channel through which divine love can authentically express itself in the world? What if God rejects not compassion itself, but the form of compassion that silences the very spiritual consciousness through which genuine divine connection becomes possible? This isn't speculation, but a perspective supported by evidence throughout religious traditions, from Jesus's balance of compassionate service and contemplative withdrawal to Buddha's equal emphasis on compassion and wisdom. From the Hebrew prophets' maintenance of their distinctive voice, even when delivering uncomfortable messages, to the Sufi mystics' insistence on preserving the integrity of the lover even in complete devotion to the beloved. The invitation is clear. Discover a form of compassion that doesn't deny God by erasing your spiritual voice, but honors God by maintaining that voice as the channel through which divine love authentically flows. This isn't a rejection of service, but its transformation. From exhausting self-sacrifice that leads to spiritual emptiness, to balanced spiritual expression that nourishes both giver and receiver. It's not compassion or spiritual integrity, but compassion through spiritual integrity. Will you have the courage to question whether your compassion expresses or erases your unique spiritual voice? And will you seek a form of compassion that God Himself would recognize not as self-denial, but as the authentic expression of divine love flowing through the distinctive spiritual channel He created in you?